Welcome to Silicon Valley Buzz, a TV show where we discuss the happenings in this, perhaps the most fertile spot on the planet for new ideas. I'm your host, Seth Shostak, and the producer is Janet Wu. Tonight, the death penalty. Is it worth keeping? There are more than 700 people on death row in the state of California, and yet we haven't actually executed any criminals since 2006. So, should we use it or should we lose it? Is capital punishment ever justified, or is it just simply a barbaric holdover from the Middle Ages? Well, Proposition 34 would end the death penalty here in California, replace it with life in prison without parole. Those already on death row who've been convicted of, well, obviously if they're on death row, they've been convicted, who are facing the death penalty would automatically have their sentences reduced to life without parole. Good idea? Or a bad idea? We'll be hearing two points of view from my guests tonight, and the first is Ellen Kreitzberg, professor of law at Santa Clara University. Ellen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Seth.
And Steve Wagstaffe. Steve is San Mateo County District Attorney, right?
Yes. Good evening, Seth.
Hi, it's good to have you here, Steve. All right, this is a tough topic, and few people are indifferent to this topic. You won't get people saying, you know, I just don't care one way or the other. So to set out the differing points of view, I'm going to ask each of you to give a kind of 2-minute recap of your position on this proposition. And let's begin with you, Ellen.
Thanks, Seth. I think people do care about this issue, but it really is not a hard decision because Proposition 34 is a smart measure that gives people justice for everyone. And what it does, when we talk about justice, we talk about two things. We talk about punishment, that these people who did horrible things and committed murder will die in prison. They will never be released. They will die in prison. But at the same time, we're going to increase our ability to keep people safe. Instead of the millions of dollars, even billions of dollars by some reports that we spend on the death penalty, we can use that money, and the proposition says $30 million a year will go to local law enforcement. And it's astounding to know that in this state, 55% of the reported rapes and 45% of the homicides are unsolved. Those perpetrators are walking the streets, taking new victims, committing more crimes. That's what will keep us safer. Let's let the prisoners who commit these horrible murders die in prison, and let's use money to solve these crimes. The other thing that we need to think about is there's no question that if you support the death penalty, you have to acknowledge that at some point, sometime, somewhere, an innocent person will be convicted, sentenced to death, and executed. We've seen it in almost every state that has the death penalty, that has caused executions. And in California, with over 720 people on death row, it's only a matter of time till it happens here as well. So do you want the death penalty? You have to be willing to not just feel that it's a good punishment, but you need to take the whole package. You need to buy it the way California is using it. There's really no one that'll tell you the death penalty works here in California. Every Chief Justice, the current one, the last Chief Justice, Ron George, even a judge down in Orange County who was called the hanging judge down there because of how many sentences of death he imposed, said that the death penalty is dysfunctional and doesn't work here in California.
Ellen makes a compelling case, Steve. You're against this proposition. Tell us why.
She makes an excellent case. I understand the point that she's raising. However, I don't think it's the right answer. And the reason for that falls into a couple of categories. First of all, this proposition tries to have this decision made based on money. Now, if the people who want to end the death penalty want California voters to do so, it should be on the basis that one of the things that Ellen just mentioned, which is, you know what, there's a danger of an innocent person being executed, or that it is wrong for religious, moral, or personal reasons, but it should not be made based on cost. And that is how this proposition is being presented. And that's the difficulty with it, because it is not going to save the money that is being proposed that it's going to do. Now, that's a long study of what one can talk about. So let's instead talk about why should it exist. For certain crimes, for the most evil crimes that can exist, there needs to be a proper response from society. And in my mind, that proper response is that you give the death penalty. Again, I'm not going to convince anybody who believes it's morally wrong. that they should then change their view. But what I will do is say, do not make your vote or your decision based on money when it's really not there. The concept of there being the danger of an innocent person being executed, in some states there have been people taken off of death row because of that. Not California. In California, we have a system that is so very extensive. Unfortunately, it takes, way too many years for it to do. I agree very much with the concept that right now the system isn't working properly. But the reason for that is the undue delays that exist in these cases, the lack of proper effort to get people to work on these cases, and that can be remedied in my view. And for that reason, this proper punishment, there needs to be some distinction between somebody who commits a murder of 2 people and a Timothy McVeigh who kills 250 people. There has to be some distinction in how we as a society respond to that. And that's what I'm most interested in.
Ellen, you've heard his arguments that this is about money and that it would result in undifferentiated punishment no matter how heinous the crime. What do you say to that?
Well, I'd say, first of all, the punishment is still differentiated. Mr. Wagstaffe, like every other district attorney in these counties, have absolute discretion to seek the greatest punishment, which would be that they would die in prison, that they would never leave alive, or some other punishment as well. And that discretion is unreviewable. He gets to make that decision based on any reasons he wants. The other thing is, as he said, we can't convince people about the moral or ethical judgments. They need to decide that. The Catholic Conference of Bishops supports this initiative. Other religious groups do. But what we're trying to get in front of the people of California is the information that has been held back from them. And that is that the death penalty costs more than keeping someone in prison for life. The legislative analyst, a completely objective person, said that it would save this state about $130 million a year to replace the death penalty with life without parole. And the fact is, we make choices. So if someone says to Mr. Wagstaffe, here's a check for $500,000, do you want 1 execution or do you want 6,000 police officers on the street? You can't have both. That's a decision they have to make.
Steve, she's saying it's a bargain.
And that's where the problem is. We don't. On Tuesday of this week, at hearings in Sacramento before the Joint Committee, legislative analyst addressed the committee. I was present for that. And in there they gave this description of the $130 million. And they were posed questions about, does it really save the money? Have you looked at other states who have ended the death penalty to find out, did they save the money? And the answer was no, we've not looked at that. We don't know, and that these are estimations. One of their estimates is that I heard this on Tuesday, that yes, there will be appeals for the people who are presently on death row. Those appeals will continue, but we won't have that problem afterward. That's silly, because of course the appeals continue. As Professor knows so very well, there's appeals on life without parole cases that go on also, and so to say that and that's not being considered when these numbers are set. The other problem on the numbers are, there have been 3, in addition to the legislative analysts, there have been 2 other excellent studies of the savings that would exist, and you know what? They give variance in numbers that varies up to 100 million difference in how much it will be saved. Nobody is accurately predicting this.
So what you're saying there is that, in fact, the uncertainty in the numbers is, well, larger than the numbers themselves. So to say that it saves money or it costs money, well, it doesn't make too much sense. Is that what I hear you saying?
I'm saying is that the numbers that they have, you can't count on it. You don't know. Nobody knows. Will there be savings? Of course. I wouldn't suggest for a minute there won't be savings. But the idea that it'll be $130 million, it's guesswork.
All right. Well, let me ask you both this. It's the case that we haven't been executing the prisoners on death row. And so why is that? That suggests to me that there's already something wrong with this system. And what is it? Is it simply the appeal process? Is that broken? Or is it that we just have some moral reluctance to actually carry out the death penalty?
Well, there has not been an execution since 2006, and that's because of legal proceedings. The federal judge found that it was unconstitutional in the way it was administered. People weren't trained properly. There was documented evidence that the drugs were administered improperly. And there was a second ruling in state court that the state had violated the Administrative Procedures Act in presenting the regulations to perform the execution. So that's been since 2006. Before that, what's happened is a series of things that have really slowed down the process. Some of it is almost 70% of the cases that finally get their way to federal court get reversed. And so those cases go back because of ineffective defense counsel, misconduct on the part of the prosecutor, missed evidence that wasn't disclosed beforehand or wasn't discovered till later, and any number of reasons. 70% of those cases are going back and then having to start all over again with trials, appeals, and working their way back through.
But Ellen, if you were convicted of a murder, and let's say the proposition passes, you're convicted of a murder, and now you're facing life without parole in prison, plus having to work, I think that's part of the proposition as well. I mean, you might still have a great deal of incentive for an appeal. So I would think that the appeals would indeed, as Steve has suggested, continue, so that the savings from not having those appeals doesn't seem to materialize.
Well, there's two things about that, Seth. One is everyone agrees that the price would be less. It's just a question of how much. But while the district attorney's office statewide has said the numbers are wrong, they're the ones that aren't willing to disclose the numbers. When the California Commission hired the RAND Corporation, a very objective body, to try and do this study, they contacted the District Attorneys Association and said, can you tell us how much personnel you put on these cases? Can we try and put these numbers together? And a blanket of silence was put statewide on the District Attorney's office, who would not disclose the numbers. So it's a little disingenuous for them to say the numbers are wrong, we've got some numbers, we're not going to give them to you, or we don't collect that information and we don't have to. And I was actually told this by some district attorneys, not by Mr. Wagstaffe, I would say, but other ones who said, we don't have to account to the people of California about how we spend the money on death penalty cases. It's within our discretion and we can do it without review.
As a district attorney, you have some explanation for what she's talking about.
She referred to it as a blanket. When one thinks a blanket, one thinks the whole table is covered. That wasn't true of my office. My office, Mr. Fox was on that commission, my predecessor in the job, and we said we will put forth what we do because we are not in any fashion. The fact that others did, what I understood was they had a very intense distrust of the impartiality of the review being done. But our view was we will cooperate, and we did provide those numbers. And I would have, as we did, urged anybody else, never be fearful. Put forth what we do and be proud of it.
Steve, you've said that this shouldn't be about the money. And I think that if you sort of step back from it, you're talking about taking someone's life. And they've done something terrible, but you're taking their life. So there's obviously a moral issue here. But why really do we want to have the death penalty? It's just so that we have one penalty beyond something like, you know, life without parole. That sounds pretty awful, dying in prison. And, you know, you look around the world, not every country has the death penalty. In fact, the United States is fairly exceptional in the first and second world to have the death penalty. So how do you argue for the death penalty? I mean, forget the money. That seems to be a somewhat contentious point here.
Yeah. And I agree with that. Okay, two reasons I would set forth for you, Seth. Number one, which is in terms of the penalty and what ought to exist, in terms of life without parole. At 4 o'clock this afternoon, I met with the mother and brother of a man who I convicted back in the mid-'80s who was serving life without parole, where they are requesting that we show leniency and mercy to him and allow him now to go free. And they were making that. And that sort of reminded me, as I spoke with them, this will forever be the case. Once, if the death penalty is gone, it isn't like life without parole will suddenly be, okay, that will now be the rule forever. Nobody's been released on a life without parole since it came back in '78. However, I know that will be the next step. Right now there is a life without parole for juveniles certified to adult court in certain circumstances. That is now being challenged in the legislature and working through. I simply don't think it finishes here. I think it's a slope we start down, and for me, it's not a good slope.
Ellen, you know, is this a matter of revenge, the death penalty, or is it justice? Because, I mean, it's one thing in the abstract to argue that you think that this is, you know, this is just not the way humans should behave toward other humans. And I can have a certain sympathy. I mean, I can understand that argument. But, you know, I can also understand that if it were your child that were raped and murdered, wouldn't you want the death penalty as punishment as a parent?
You know, I think what these parents want, and really the victims need to be the center of this conversation, and there is nothing that can be said or done that can ever fill the hole that a parent must feel for the loss of a child, or a child must feel for the loss of a parent. But killing another person, we have found time and time again, when you go back to the victims years later, even months later, they say, it did not give me peace. It did not give me the closure that I was promised. It's really a false promise to many of these victims because they believe that something will come out of it that it won't. The other thing is, remember, we have 1,000 homicides a year, more or less, in the state of California. Only very few are the ones that will be sought after to get the death penalty. So we create essentially a hierarchy of victims. Now, it's supposed to be the worst of the worst, and in many of those cases, most people could look at those facts and say, this is awful, this really is the worst of the worst. And other ones maybe not so, but to those family members, that crime is the worst of the worst, and yet they're told, we're not going to spend those resources on your family. We're going to spend it for someone else's family. And what about the parents whose children have been murdered, whose perpetrator has never been found? Those people have not gotten justice. So yes, in some ways we come back to fairness, we come back to money, because when there's a finite amount of money and you have to make decisions, do we execute one person or do we open up a cold case file in our county so we can close these homicides? Do we test the rape cases that are sitting on shelves all around the state? And I heard on the radio yesterday that in Los Angeles they're not going to do fingerprint testing because they don't have money. We just need to figure out how to give everyone justice.
Well, let me follow up on this just a little bit, because you said earlier that I think only 65% of the homicides in the state of California are actually solved. Okay, now that's not a terribly high percentage, but I don't think it's so different from other states, is it? I mean, if there I don't know, 36 states in the United States that have the death penalty. There are plenty of states, 2 dozen states or whatever it is, that don't. And is the homicide rate solution, should I say, the percentage of cases that are solved, is that higher there because they don't have the death penalty and all these expenses?
Well, the problem with the budget here is somewhat of a new, the depth of the problem of the budget is somewhat of a new phenomenon. So when we talk about percentage, it may seem like it's not that bad, but in Los Angeles County, we're talking about 5,000 homicides that have gone unsolved. Those perpetrators are still walking the street. The rape kits the rape cases may even be able to solve more easily because we actually have samples of semen that are not being tested that may actually give us an identification of an individual who's a perpetrator of rape, who may be continuing to rape. So counties are saying we cannot do this, we don't have the resources, and we need to figure out how to get them the resources. And when we add the death penalty, we say, what else are we getting? What is the added benefit we're getting from the death penalty? We can make sure people die in prison, that they will never be released, that they will no longer have the fame or notoriety of being on death row. They will no longer get a single cell that they get in death row now, and they will have to work every day in prison, which they do not do now, and constantly pay back to their victims. That's important.
What do you say to the argument that we can actually help track down criminals that we're not tracking down now if we pass this proposition?
Take the best detectives in the world, bring them forward, and tell me how they're going to solve gang homicides, and a large portion of these are gang homicides where nobody will come forward, where it isn't a matter of the lack of investigative resources. That's certainly been my experience in San Mateo County. It's not the lack of investigative resources in many of these unsolved cases. It's just simply we don't have witnesses that will come forward. It's gang on gang. There was a homicide in Oakland this morning in which I heard on the TV, they said, and the victims who are the witnesses to this would not cooperate. Now, how, by throwing money at more detectives and people on the street, is that going to solve that? The professor appropriately notes, by using the word may, that may solve some of these. And the answer is that's why it's so speculative. That's why we're making a decision on an important issue on a word that says may. And that's why I don't think this issue should be decided based on money. If the issue should be decided, it's because it's either right or it's wrong as a punishment for this state, not because we think we have this undue hope. And where's this money going to come from? From the general fund, the money saved, it comes out of general fund. And that money is money that the legislature could spend elsewhere if they felt it appropriate. Instead, it's being sent to the people, said to the people, do it this way, because if you spend it on this, we will solve homicides. It's speculative, and there's no reason to believe it will come about.
What about efficacy? Does the death penalty actually deter crime? Because I think that for a number of years, 5, 7 years, there was no death penalty in California. Did the homicide rate go down? Did it go up? It might have gone up. People would say, hey, look, at least I won't be sent to the chair now.
Here's the answer to that. First of all, back in the 70s during that interval, it was during a time period where crime was going up at large, at all levels in the mid-70s. So it's probably not a fair way for me to say, yes, and homicides went up. But what we do know, and this was a major topic at the discussion before the legislature on Tuesday of this week, was that, you really can't know because we don't know who it deters. We know the people who are committing the crimes, they've been interviewed and talked to, and most of them, it was never in their mind whatsoever. But what we don't know and never can know is who did it, who didn't do it. Because they're not coming forward to say, I was going to commit this murder, but I didn't because, therefore, that's what we call an imponderable. We'll never know.
So, in other words, it's hard to justify on the basis of efficacy. It's not because the death penalty deters homicides, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I have said that from day one.
Okay. All right. That sounds like a good argument for you, though, because to me, that throws it back into the moral arena.
Right. I think we agree on that. There really is no credible evidence on the issue of deterrence, one way or the other. The studies are all over the place, and there's no way to say it does or it does not deter. I think that's really just a wash and a non-argument. If we go back into the moral arena, we can talk about a lot of these issues. I mean, you brought up that we stand alone in the world. You cannot be a member of the European Union if you have the death penalty. You have Russia and Turkey abolishing the death penalty because they want to become a member of this economic group. You have every Eastern European country, when they would overthrow their totalitarian government, the first step the government would take would be to get rid of the death penalty because it was a sign and a symbol of totalitarian governments. Now, we shouldn't be take certain action because Europe does it or doesn't do it, but it does tell us where we stand. And maybe more importantly, what I've heard from people who work in the State Department, it compromises America's position abroad as a spokesperson for human rights. In Europe, this is a human rights issue.
Well, all right. So, but even aside from its possible utility in foreign policy, I mean, there are 33 states in this country that still do have the death penalty. And I can hardly believe that was forced on all these 33 states, Alan. So, what do they say in those states? I mean, why is it that the populace supports the death penalty, whereas, in France, the Netherlands, Belgium, they wouldn't?
Well, if we look at also the trend, in the last 5 years, 5 states have abolished the death penalty. So I think it's fair to say when you look at what's happened nationally, the attitudes are changing. If you look at polling in California, a poll came out today that said 50% of the people in California now say they would replace the death penalty with life without parole. So I don't think we are any longer a nation that looks to the death penalty as a way to solve our problems. I think it was a political tool for politicians, that it was a very easy platform to say, I am tough on crime, let's execute people. And in California, what's happened is we've expanded and expanded our death penalty. We have the broadest death penalty in the country, that it can include virtually almost every kind of first-degree murder, because it was done without people being well-informed and knowledgeable about how it really operates.
Steve, what about this argument that, people say that they favor life without parole? Is that possibly because they don't recognize that life without parole might not actually be life without parole, or is it that's just the way they feel about it?
It's both. It's both of what you just said. And I think it's, as Ellen just said, it's an uneducated electorate. That's probably one of the problems with doing things by initiative, and that's why things get added, all these special circumstances. I agree with her. Personally, I think the law should have a far fewer number of cases that are eligible for the death penalty, although less than 2% of the cases could be sought is it ever sought in. So it's a very low number where discretion is being exercised by district attorneys in a variety of ways. And one other point I want to make about Europe and its countries, and certainly they can go the way they want. Everybody in this world, in this country today, is where are we all rushing? We're not rushing to Europe. We're rushing to China. That is the modern country we want to deal with and connect with and call modernized, and that's on the cover of Time magazine and every other magazine. And they have the death penalty for crimes that don't even involve the death of another person. They executed last year 2 people, corporate executives, for allowing there to be tainted milk. So when one talks about that, that's why I don't rely on what other countries are doing. I rely on what this state feels is right.
But maybe I'm picking a particularly bad example. I mean, maybe we do want to emulate other countries when, shall we say, they do something that we admire.
Yes.
So
sure.
Let me just finish here with you, Steve, on this. Can you imagine any time, decades down the road, when we abolish the death penalty in California, if it doesn't happen with this proposition? Do you see it going indefinitely into the future?
Having been a prosecutor for 35 years in San Mateo County, and having watched the cycle of how the legislature and the community responds to crime, I would never make any prediction as to what would occur. To do that would be a fool's game.
All right. Well, listen, I want you each, in the spirit of this debate, and it's a friendly debate, I have to say. I thought you might get out of your chairs and, try and inflict some sort of punishment on one another. To recap your position, make your pitch. You get 1 minute each to do that. And I'm going to start, I think we'll start with you, Steve, because you went second in the beginning here. So for no on Proposition 34, Steve Wagstaffe.
Thank you. I am asking the citizens of this state to vote no on Proposition 34. I think it is selling itself as something it's not, that it's going to save some extraordinary money and allow crimes to be solved. I don't think that's what is going to happen. Instead, the choice ought to be is whether the death penalty is an appropriate punishment in certain cases for the most evil people, for the Richard Ramirez's, Night Stalkers, and people like that. The people in my community have said yes in numerous cases over the years. I tried one a year and 2 years ago. I tried a death penalty case, and 12 citizens said this was the appropriate verdict in that case for that evil crime that occurred. And I think as a society we should distinguish between, again, certain types of crimes that are murders that involve one level versus the horrific crimes, whether it's a Colorado shooting, Columbine, or what. That, I think, is why we ought to maintain this as an option for the community to decide. Thank you.
Ellen Kreitzberg.
Thank you, Seth. I think Proposition 34 really gives the people of California a real choice and is trying to inform them about all the aspects of the death penalty. The death penalty doesn't make us safer. We now have the former warden of San Quentin Prison, Jeannie Woodford, who is out campaigning and presided over 4 executions, saying we need to stop the death penalty. It just doesn't work. It doesn't make us safer. We have district attorneys mostly in counties in Southern California who are exercising their discretion by saying, I'm going to seek the death penalty in every murder case in which it applies. I'm not going to be as discriminating or as particular about going through those cases as maybe Mr. Wagstaffe is in San Mateo County. So we have a system that's broken. We have a system that doesn't work. And what the proposition will do is make sure these criminals are put in a tiny cell, maybe with a friend, for the rest of their lives until they die in prison. That will keep us safe.
Ellen, thank you very much. So, is capital punishment still beneficial to California? Well, obviously, it's up to you to decide. I want to thank my guests, Ellen Kreitzberg, Steve Wagstaffe, for being with us, with their very reasoned and articulate discussion of Proposition 34, the proposition to repeal the death penalty. Thanks also to our hardworking KMVT staff and our tireless producer, Janet Wu. I'm Seth Shostak, inviting you to join us each month for Silicon Valley Buzz right here on KMVT. Thank you and good night.